After putting up the roof insulation and building a partition wall frame, it came time to start insulating and lining the shed walls. Carrying on from the previous video in the series, I started by marking out the stud positions on the floor to help line up the screws. Anyone who has installed fiberglass insulation will know that it will make you itch like a flea-bitten dog, and after trying insulation batts made from wool, I found that to be not much better. I stumbled onto this polymer product at a local manufacturer and decided to give it a try. It turned out to be tip-top in terms of keeping the itch away, but I won't know if it works as well as the other products for a while, since it's just come into winter where I am. I started out cutting it with a knife since that's what I was doing with the roof batts, but I worked out it can be torn fairly easily and ripped them to size to save time. So I ripped some pieces to fill the gaps, and after insulating the first section I threw up a sheet of ply. I made sure the first sheet was plumb and screwed it in. The screws I used were these self-tapping 30mm Tech screws, which worked really well with the impact driver. Then I continued on, insulating a section the size of the ply sheet, and then screwing that sheet to the wall. I used the level to help mark the screw positions to keep them in line. I kept the sheets about 10mm off the floor, using a strip of timber moulding as a spacer. This is to prevent any standing water from soaking into the ply and running it out. The steel frames have inconsistent stud spacing, meaning that if I started sheeting from the left side of the wall, the first 2 sheets would join at studs, but the remaining 3 sheets would end in mid-air, just short of the stud, and it would be hard to get them flush with each other. As you can see, I had them join about 100mm past the studs and ended up with corners bowing in and out. I was hoping the ply would be stiff enough to keep itself straight, but it's not, so I'm thinking I'll run a strip of timber around the horizontal join and try to pull the sheets straight with some screws. The ply sheets are 2400 by 1200 by 9mm thick structural CD ply, chosen for its structural rigidity so that it can take some load wherever I need it, within reason of course. I moved on to the timber frame wall next and switched to the nail gun to secure the ply, which sped things up quite a bit. Then things slowed down again when it came time to cut out the window opening. But it was a simple matter of measuring, marking and cutting with the circular saw, then slapping it on. The next day the process was repeated for the other side of the window. Then it came time to cut around the cavity slider. It couldn't be fastened with long nails or screws, so I ended up using these 20mm timber screws, which are long enough to keep the ply on the wall without going through the door. Then it was simple enough to cut out a piece for the other side of the doorway and tidy up this little wall beside the roller door. The angled top pieces were up next. I used a straight edge to project up the position of the lower sheet and measured upwards to get my cut length. This method was a little awkward but allowed me to get a pretty accurate measurement. The next piece had this steel brace to contend with, but conveniently it landed right on the joint between this sheet and the next, making it easy to allow for. The centre sheet needed a little creative measuring, but I'm glad to say it came out okay. The second steel brace landed near the centre of the next sheet, so it needed to be cut into 2 pieces to fit around it. This made the gap between the next sheet a little bigger than I'd like, but it's nothing a tuber gap filler can't fix. The last piece of ply in the workshop was this little wall beside the roller door. But before I could do that, I needed to put in some pine stud to fasten this timber you can see here in the foreground to the right hand side of the side wall. I'm planning a timber feature wall, so all this 100-year-old hoop pine needs to be cleaned up and run through the table saw, which is currently underway and is taking forever. That will be the subject of the next video to do with the shed. Then it was on to the garage, starting with this tiny wall beside the roller door. I started off using masking tape to hold the batts in place, as you may have noticed earlier, until I ran out. Then I resorted to using packing tape to hold them in, which actually stuck better to the steel frames, and had the added benefit of being on this handy dispenser. Nice! I chipped away at the rest of the wall, with the space feeling better with every sheet I threw up. The vision I've had in my head of my oasis away from the troubles of everyday life was finally starting to come together. It was no longer a hot and dusty hellhole, and those who know me know how I feel about hellholes. Not that keen on them. The hardest part of this wall was cutting the ply out around the roller door bracket that was hard up against the frame. But it turned out okay, and on with the rest of the top sheets. Again, the braces needed to be allowed for. I'll cut some trim to neaten the joints up when the time comes, and run some timber strip over the joint between the upper and lower ply sheets to pull them flush with each other. The back wall was pretty straightforward, with just a whole bunch of straight cuts. Then lastly, onto the timber frame wall. I hadn't put in some of the noggins at 2400 high, and I wasn't going to, but seeing how the ply fit on the steel frame walls, I decided to pop them in. And then it was the same procedure as on the other side of the wall to get the ply sheets up, cutting out around the window and the door, and using the short screws to fasten the sheet to the cavity slider frame. I decided not to cover the truss on this wall, which made it easier to finish. It wasn't really necessary since it would hardly be seen once I put up the planned storage racks. Also, the steel truss was 5mm wider than the timber frame, so it wasn't flush this side. And another also, the cost of ply was starting to really add up at $50 a sheet, so it was a no-brainer to leave that truss uncovered. So the walls are lined, except for the feature wall. I'll fix up the warped ply with some trim once the time comes. I'm very happy with how it's turning out, and it already feels like a much more inviting place to be. But for now, I'm working on processing all this old timber so it can be screwed to the remaining bare steel frame. Stay tuned for that in the next shed video. Thanks for watching to the end, I really appreciate it. If you liked the cut of my jib and reckon I deserve a beer for my troubles, check out my PayPal link in the description to make a one-off donation. Also, if you're in the market for some reasonably priced gear for photography and videography, click my affiliate link with Neewer and check out their wares. Here's cheers.